Please note, the following is not an official forecast. Always refer to the National Weather Service, National Hurricane Center, and your local weather office for guidance on hazards in your area. Good evening, and thank you for joining me as we take a look at the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. I don't really want to get into numbers or predictions quite yet, just because we are in a period of transition, and we're going to get into a couple of the reasons for that. There are indications that we may have an active season, but how active is kind of still a question. So taking a look at the Atlantic sea surface temperature chart at the moment, the current pattern that we have, we've got still some cool pockets over here in the main development region, the MDR. However, those are starting to go away here over the last couple of weeks due to some rapid warming. Still have this large warm area in the subtropical Atlantic in the western half. However, we do have cooler pockets over here in the North Atlantic in the east, followed by this warm area that's down here in that transition zone between the MDR and the subtropics. This is a very odd pattern at the moment. It probably isn't going to be what it looks like when the season starts, or at least when we get into the meat of the season, just because I think we're still transitioning from the pattern that we saw last year to the pattern that we are going to see here in the next couple of months. Now, taking a look at the last 15 days, are changes that we're seeing in the sea surface temperature anomalies of the North Atlantic. You can see in the MDR and just north of it in that transition zone, we've got this expanding and warming area right along Cape Verde. South of the Cape Verde, we've got even some warmer pockets starting to show up. And then this broader area of warming in that transition zone between the subtropics down here or between the tropics down here and the subtropics. So we've got that starting to change. That cold look that we saw last year, that's starting to go away. And we've started to see a lot more cooling in the eastern Atlantic, particularly up here east of the Bahamas in the subtropical area south of Bermuda. And again, that's going to start to change the pattern that we've seen the last few years, especially last year, where we had this huge area of warm water that was going out all the way from the Bahamas all the way to Europe, really. And then the other thing to take note of is down here under Africa, we've got some cool waters down here or cooling waters down here near the equator. And that's another pattern that we need to take a look at, because it is a difference from what we saw last year. Now, we're taking a look at a quick animation showing the last 30 days of sea surface temperature anomaly change. So you can see we've got this cool area down here in the MDR, very strong, and then all of a sudden, just in the past week or two, we've had warming that's been going on up here in this transition zone and down here around the Cabo Verde Islands. And as well, you can see this giant area of warm water over here started to wane a little bit, as well as much more cooling down here near the leewards. Again, up here, this is when we begin the animation. It looks very similar to what we saw at the beginning of last year, with this big warm burst all the way across to Europe. But now we're seeing that weaken a little bit. We've got some belts of colder area in here around the Azores. So it's starting to get cut into a little bit. And that's going to have some implications for stability in the Atlantic, as well as this area down here. Keep an eye on this part near the equator. You can see this is starting to warm a little bit more, but it's something to keep an eye on here in the next few weeks and really into June, to see if this pattern continues to warm down here in the MDR, and it continues to see cool anomalies growing in the subtropical Atlantic. Now, what's causing these pattern changes? Right now, you can see we've got some very, very large features in the Atlantic. This one here, this large low, has been something that we've seen a lot of in the past couple of weeks. These very big troughs, low pressures, they're really digging way down into the Atlantic. And what that's doing is it's causing a weakening of the trade. So normally down here across the MDR and where the intertropical convergence zone is, we have easterlies. So we have easterlies that are blowing from the MDR towards the leewards, and that's your normal trade winds. But right now, this large area and these digging troughs, they've been pushing back against those trade winds. And what normally happens when the trade winds are strong or normal is you've got a cool pocket in the MDR here because the wind's blowing this way. They're pushing that warmer water that comes around Africa. They're pushing it this way. So you'll see this part of the intertropical convergence zone starting to warm up as the trades push that across. But what's happened is those normal strong trades going across, they've now been pushed back by this large low area of low pressure. So then you've got this warm water that's starting to pool and sit a little bit longer instead of being pushed to the west. So that's one of the reasons that we're seeing this level of warming over there in the MDR. And here is a look from Cyclonic WX. We've got the sea surface temperature anomalies for the MDR. This is sourced from NOAA Coral Reef Watch. And you can see just in the past week or so, we've really had this warming trend in the MDR. And this one over here, this is the MDR minus the global tropics. So this kind of takes away that warm background that we normally see and that we are seeing in the modern era. So this is a little bit more representative of the MDR relative to the rest of the globe when you have a fairly warm background. And this is just the raw anomaly based on climatology. And we pretty much have a neutral anomaly when you take away that warm background. Now on the other side, we've got the subtropics. This has actually shown a little bit more of a trend over a longer period than MDR has. So you can see we've got it really sort of peaked in February. And then ever since about mid to late February, we've been on a very marked downward trend of that sea surface temperature anomaly in the Atlantic subtropics. So that's something that is a little bit more eye-catching right now. The warming in the MDR is pretty short term. We're not sure just how long it's going to be warming, but this subtropical anomaly, this is a little bit bigger trend and could be more indicative of what we'll be seeing going into the hurricane season. Now, taking a look at last year, versus this year, or as close as possible. This one is from May 13th, and this one's from today, the 28th. This is our sea surface temperature anomalies. We can see last year we had that large area in the subtropics all the way from the Bahamas, all Azores, Canary Islands, all the way to Spain. It was one big mass of anomalously warm air. And so you've got this, which is going to be causing more of an unstable environment. We had what's known as an Atlantic Nino, kind of the little brother of the El Nino, where we have a warm belt right across the equator in the Atlantic. There's not a lot of study out there quite yet on Atlantic Nino. There's a lot of unknowns. It's certainly less studied than El Nino. It's more of a smaller synoptic scale feature, whereas El Nino has global implications. But Atlantic Nino, we do believe, has impacts on hurricane season and larger scale features. One thing we know for sure is because this is going to be warmer than normal, again, you're going to have more unstable rising air in this area, in this belt, than you would normally when you have that Atlantic Nino pattern. Now, at the same time, last year we had this cool, stable pocket in the spring, and this was kind of a persistent feature for into the early part of last year's hurricane season. And MDR really didn't catch up and warm up until later on in the season. So this was pretty representative of the look that we got going into the season. And when you've got these two belts of warm, unstable air, and they've sandwiched this cool, stable, sinking air mass over the MDR, it's going to exacerbate things and put a lid on development, because you've got this rising, moist, unstable air in these pockets. It's got to go somewhere. So it sinks into this stable air. And so that puts a lid on a lot of development. Any of these waves that were coming off of Africa early season last year really could not get going and struggled. And this is something we've seen fairly frequently in the last several years, is where we don't really get a lot of those CV long track hurricanes or tropical storms coming off, developing quickly, and then just marching along the Atlantic or recurving in the central Atlantic. We get a few, but we don't get nearly as many as we did back during the early part of the AMO in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, when we just saw them come off, develop right away, and march on. It's mainly because we've had these stability issues, primarily because of the subtropical warm feature. 2012 was really the rise of when we first saw this feature, and it's been persistent since then. So this subtropical anomaly will continue to put a lid on some of the instability in the MDR for the foreseeable future, if it remains persistent. Now, looking at what we have this year, you can see that there's been quite a change. At the beginning of April, when some of these agencies were putting out their 2022 season outlooks, we had a look that was very similar to this. It was almost a carbon copy of 2021. But now things are definitely changing. The colder pockets are not nearly as deep and as cold as they were last year. We've got a definite, hugely different signal here in the subtropics. We don't have this huge expanse of warmer anomaly like we did last year. Very, very marked difference. And we also don't have Atlantic Nino. Atlantic Nino is either on the way out, or it is gone, because we no longer have that jet look of warm water right along the equator. A couple of different areas now where this is pretty much neutral. This, if you evened it out, is still a bit warm, but you could say it's on the neutral side of warm. And then this is much closer to neutral here in the MDR. So instead of having these two warm, unstable masses influencing the MDR, now you've got pretty much a clean slate, almost a neutral slate here across the Atlantic for the MDR to not really have those stability issues that we had last year and in several years previous, if this continues to develop. Now, could we see the MDR become warm and have a significant warm anomaly? It's possible. We'll look at some of those things looking ahead to May. Could it cool, and could we get this sort of pattern when we get into June? We could. It's hard to see that far ahead. So we could go back to this state, or we may go to something completely different. But as of right now, it does look like we're transitioning into something that is kind of a different look that we've seen in recent years. It's hard to find a really good analog right now, but I also don't think this is the look that we're getting that we'll end up with when the season begins. So right now it's really transitioning, but it looks like things will be a little bit more conducive across the Eastern Atlantic as far as stability and those sea surface temperature anomalies. Now, looking back last year at that Atlantic Nino phenomenon, one thing we do know that is an effect of the Atlantic Nino is that we've got this warmer pocket of water that tends to pool near the coast of Africa and then right along the equator. And what that does is you've got convergence here. So you've got winds blowing towards the equator. And when that is blowing towards the equator, it's blowing away from the MDR up here. So you've got divergence up here because you got winds blowing away. You've got convergence down here. And that's what causes a lot more instability down across the equator in an Atlantic Nino's situation versus up here in the MDR where your tropical waves are going to struggle because there's not a lot of that rising action. There's more divergence. Now we do have also an effect on the West African monsoon as well. Normally, in a normal year, you would get more of a monsoon up across the Sahel and then off of Africa or right along near the Cabo Verde Islands. But during Atlantic Nino, like we saw last year, that tends to be displaced a little bit further south, closer to the equator. And when those waves are coming off further south, they're going to have a lot more struggle to gain spin, both because of the Coriolis effect and because when you have the convergence down here near the equator, it's less likely to be able to gain that latitude to spin up. So that's why we saw a lot of waves struggle, especially early season, was that Atlantic Nino was helping push that West African monsoon further south. And that we should not see this year. The Atlantic Nino looks like it is gone, and we should not see these effects at least this season. Now, while the pattern in the Atlantic is a little bit unclear at this time, what is more clear now is our ENSO La Nina situation. We've got obviously here a very classic look La Nina signal across the Pacific equator and then the Eastern Pacific. Very strong, so very, very cold anomalies at the moment. And this is something that the models had been slowly inching towards this winter and early in the spring. And finally, in the last couple of months, it's pretty clear that we are going back into La Nina from neutral. So this would be a triple dip La Nina, which is very rare. I believe the last one we had ended in 2001. But we are more than likely going to be ending up with a La Nina, or at the very least, a cold neutral anomaly in the Pacific. So this is going to make the environment in the Atlantic again more conducive for Atlantic tropical development, as we've seen in La Nina years, and as well as in neutral years. So anytime we have a cool neutral, normally we see a bump in our numbers of tropical cyclones developing. This is a look at the CFS forecast for ENSO state. We've got pretty much all of them are saying that we will stay at least cooler than neutral. In fact, it's a little bit more aggressive than some of the other models in that it's showing that we'll basically stay in La Nina. Most of the ensemble members are actually staying in well within La Nina territory. They're not even a triple dip. It's just going to be a very long La Nina event on some of these ensembles. But the CFS actually sniffed out this current situation before a lot of the other models did. It was the first to really go all in on at least a triple dip La Nina. So it's got some fairly good skill with these ENSO conditions, and it did see well ahead of time that we could be going into another La Nina this year. Now, looking at the wind anomaly in the Atlantic, we're going to take a look at the CFS forecast. This is our zonal wind anomalies. Now, remember, the reason that we had that warming in the MDR the last couple of weeks was a cool anomaly, or was a wind switch where we had weaker trades in this belt down here because of this broad area of low pressure that was pushing back cyclonically against those trades, and that weakened those trade winds that was trying to push the water west. Looking at this animation, you can see down here the purple colors are the weaker than normal trades. The red colors would be a trade burst, an acceleration of those trade winds. If we saw a significant trade burst across this area, we would see kind of a reversal of what we have now. We'd see the MDR start to cool back up. We'd see the subtropics start to warm back up. But the CFS really doesn't see much. We see a little bit of maybe a trade burst in the next week or so. And then towards the end of May into June, we don't really see a lot of those deeper red colors down in here. It's more of a neutral to a negative, especially that last couple of weeks into June. We see another kind of weakening of the trades, which we could see another warm period if this forecast comes to fruition, which CFS does have a little bit of skill in this area, but again, a month out, it's kind of hard to really verify that sort of forecast. Now, looking at some other forecasts, this is the NMME model, the multi-ensemble model, and it's got this is our precipitation anomaly forecast for June and July. The NMME only comes out once a month. It comes out usually around the 7th or 8th of each month. And what you really want to focus on with these is really a couple of areas. You want to focus on the MDR and on Central America, Eastern Pacific, this area where normally we would see the Central American gyre. Don't really ever pay attention to any of these anomalies unless it's just a huge, very deep anomaly. These are a little bit harder to verify in these areas just because the pattern is much more dependent on where troughs and where ridges set up. So you really can't glean any sort of track information off of any of these anomalies that are closer to North America or in the Caribbean. But the areas with a little bit more skill are going to be the MDR and around Central America. And here you see, obviously, we've got a high precip anomaly forecasted. This is for June of this year, and then this is for July. And this is kind of a flip from what we had last year. Last year showed a dry anomaly up here around 10 north and a wet anomaly down here towards 5 north and closer to the equator. And the reason for that, again, was that Atlantic Nino, which is creating that instability closer to the equator, and also the ITCZ being displaced further to the south. But this year we're seeing more of that precip anomaly near 10 north. It's just right along the belt that we normally see a lot of tropical development. It's not too far north. It's not too far south. It's kind of a Goldilocks zone right in here. It's just right. So this is where we would normally see a pretty active, at least West African monsoon, lots of waves coming off. And this is still fairly early. This is June. And then also, again, expanding even more right along that Goldilocks zone. We've got that wet anomaly forecasted for July. And I really don't want to go out any further than that because Once you start to get, 3-4 months ahead, it's very, very difficult for that forecast to verify. So that's why I've stopped here at July, just because that's about the farthest credible forecast that we could look at on these climate models. But that is interesting to see that flip from last year that showed that wet belt down here to this year where it's up here where we would normally see a lot more development. So what are my takeaways for this upcoming season? Right now, the North Atlantic currently is in a state of transition. So there's a lot of uncertainty for the outlook of this hurricane season, just because things aren't as set in stone as we thought that they would be. It's changing a lot more than what we saw last year, and the pattern no longer matches what we saw last year. Steady or strengthening La Nina is conducive for an active Atlantic hurricane season this year. That is probably the biggest factor that is not a surprise, seeing these forecasts come in for La Nina and Enso State. And La Nina has always been a background that's been conducive for tropical development. Even if we aren't quite at the La Nina threshold at the part of the season, even if we're at cool neutral sometimes is even more conducive for tropical cyclones in the Atlantic. So the base state we know is pretty good for this season. The current trends to watch: the warming MDR the last couple of weeks is a big one, but even more so, I think the cooling of the subtropics is a big factor that needs to be watched. Especially since this cooling of the subtropics has been going on for 2 months now, whereas the warming of the MDR has just been fairly short term. So those are two big factors. The lack of the Atlantic Nino state also will factor into whether there's any sort of stability issues in the MDR. Because we don't have Atlantic Nino now, and unless one rapidly develops in the next couple of months, which I don't foresee, then we should see less of a suppressed state in the MDR when we have tropical waves coming off and starting to develop. The 2022 hurricane season has a high likelihood of being active, but the patterns that develop over the next 1 to 2 months will determine if it becomes a very active or a hyperactive season. Indicators there that we could get a hyperactive season, but they don't quite match what we've seen in the past with hyperactive seasons. So how these trends develop in the next month, 2 months, is going to be a big factor in determining if it is active. And this level of uncertainty is one of the main reasons that I'm not going to give out any sort of numbers or forecast yet, just because this transition, we don't know if it's going to be just active or hyperactive. So we'll see here in the next month or two. I'll probably have something for you by the end of May where I do have some numbers and a forecast. I'm also looking at track states and what kind of tracks we might be able to see over this season, and hopefully I'll have that to you by the end of next month before the beginning of the 2022 hurricane season. We'll also be doing tropical updates this season when we get any sort of development or name storms that we need to watch. So please like and subscribe so you can get your notifications when I do come out with new videos this season. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk again soon.